"Hey, check this out," Emma shouts out. I sluggishly approach, understanding that we still had a lot of unpacking to do. Entering the bedroom, I saw my girlfriend looking at our closet with a gaze of wonderment. I smiled, knowing that she had wanted more space for her clothes when we decided to move. The closer I got to Emma, the more I realized she wasn't looking directly into the closet, though. Her head was tilted upward. "What are you looking at?" I asked, with a slight chuckle in my voice. I crept up behind her and embraced her, pushing her hair aside as I applied a delicate kiss to her neck. She remained quiet for a few seconds as her stare didn't give. She raised an arm and pointed up towards the ceiling in the closet. My eyes carefully followed her direction as I locked in on what she'd been staring at. It was pure darkness, some void of emptiness that hovered above in the closet. I let go of Emma's waist and stepped inside, turning on the small light that was mounted on the side of the closet. To my astonishment, it was still pitch dark. It was bewildering how tall the ceiling must be, which was weird since everywhere else in the townhouse had normal-sized ceilings. "This is weird, isn't it?" She nodded her head in agreement, still remaining silent. I reached for my phone to turn on the flashlight and pointed it upward, hoping to see how far this mysterious ceiling extended. As the fading light shined above the darkness, it seemed to swallow it up, devouring every proton, leaving me and Emma completely confounded. At this point, my curiosity had been triggered, and I pondered on how I could test the heights of the ceiling. I could hear Emma walking away, seemingly already bored with the mystery that laid out before us. We moved to this new home, leaving behind a brutal past that both Emma and I were better off leaving behind. I guess mainly it was Emma who was. She had a, let's say, not-so-friendly ex. His name was Jake, and he was borderline stalking her. I constantly reassured Emma that I was here to protect her, that I wouldn't let anything happen to her. I even bought a gun, something that made me feel uncomfortable, but she was worth the uncomfort. She pleaded for us to move to a new city, to get away from him, which I didn't mind. I loved her after all, and my kind of job allowed me the luxury of working from home. So I agreed. We both deleted our social media accounts and decided to start new, an adventure shared between the both of us. Now, we found ourselves in this new home, with a bizarre closet. For the next few days, we did all of our unpacking, and Emma seemed to lose interest in the mysterious closet, though the mystery stayed at the forefront of my mind. I found myself constantly bringing it up, and after a while she would just roll her eyes at me. I think I was annoying her, but every day when I had a bit of time, I would try to find a new method to see how endless the endless closet really was. I grabbed a broom and a ladder. I jabbed at it into the air to see if it would hit anything. I used a tape measure, extending it out as far as it would go to hopefully find that it hit something. But it didn't. I scratched my head over and over, wanting to know what the heck this thing was. I grabbed a baseball bat and readied myself. I'm not the best at sports, but I did play a little softball when I was a kid. I took my stance and cautiously aimed upward. With all my strength, I flung a small ball up in the air. "Watch out, everyone, it's Tom Brady," my girlfriend said from behind me. I turned to her quickly, a bit startled, and then raised my pointer finger up to my lips, suggesting for her to be quiet. "Shh, and Tom Brady doesn't play baseball. He's I promptly stopped, though, when I realized the ball hadn't come back down. Emma just looked at me with befuddlement. "What?" she asked. "The ball didn't come back down." "Huh. Well, don't go get an extension ladder and try to climb up there. You might get stuck, too." She said it with a whimsical tone, though her eyes portrayed as much concern as I did. Later that day, I scoured the internet, looking for the best deal on a drone, one with a solid range. As I clicked through the different pages, Emma suggested something that never dawned on me. She told me to ask our landlord about the closet. Why didn't I think of that? I figured before spending money we didn't really have, I should at least ask about the home I found myself in. That night I had the strangest dream, one where I found myself in a home built out of gingerbread. I was lost in what seemed to be an endless loop of corridors, the walls gruesomely crumbling apart as I walked past. Turning corner after corner, I endlessly searched for a way out, as the scent of fresh gingerbread penetrated my nostrils. I could feel my panic morph into trepidation as I began to run faster and faster, wanting to escape because, by this point, I didn't feel alone anymore. I felt like someone was in here with me. I could make out the subtle hints of footsteps, usually one, like someone was limping. They would take a step forward with one foot and drag the other. I was absolutely frantic by this point, and that's when I began to chew on the walls. I was trying to eat my way out of this horrid place. I chomped and grinded with all the muscles I had in my jaw, the sound of gingerbread crunching underneath the pressure of my bite, inundating the air as my heartbeat accelerated. I closed my eyes, not wanting to see whatever was causing those devilish footsteps. Ugh! That's when the most dreadful scream woke me up. I rapidly came to my senses and realized it was Emma. She was still asleep. I shook her awake, and she popped out of her slumber as she horrifically gasped for air. I held her close as she trembled, calming her as she began to sob. I asked if she'd had a nightmare, perhaps the same one I'd had about the gingerbread house, but she looked at me confused. No, it was about him. Him being her ex, Jake, the real monster. My fear gradually shifted to anger, understanding how much he still affected her. The jerk had tortured my beautiful Emma. I could feel my blood boil as I glanced over at the nightstand where I kept my gun, fantasizing about how I would put this guy in his place for good. Can you bring me a glass of water or something?" Emma asked. I kissed her forehead and got out of bed, walking over to the kitchen. The memory of my horrific nightmare was now a mere whisper, but that's when I encountered the most frightening scene. The pantry door in our kitchen was wide open, and it appeared as if someone had been rifling through our food. On the floor, I could see a box of cookies ripped open. It practically torn to shreds. Cookie crumbs laid everywhere, scattered across the once polished floor. My mouth gaped open in utter disbelief. Who the hell had broken into our house? I ran back to the bedroom and grabbed my handgun. Emma looked on with curiosity and followed me as I returned to the kitchen. I could hear her asking questions, but I just ignored her as my eyes scanned the living room and dining room for any possible intruders. After a minute, I finally answered her. "Look, we must have rats," I explained. "Rats, of course. That's what it is. It had to be rats," I told myself in my head as I looked on at all the mess. "Why do you have your gun?" she asked. I stumbled over my own words, not sure how to answer without alarming her. What could I say? That I think an intruder had broken in? Obviously rats made more sense. Well, were you going to shoot the rats?" Emma interjected with disapproval. I didn't say anything back. I figured I'd let her think I was a weirdo, willing to shoot a rat. Rather that than scare her with her original thought of someone breaking in. The next day I reached out to the landlord, told her about the puzzling closet, and her response was well measured, much like Emma's. She told me that with these new townhouses, the developers pushed for completion way too fast, leaving unfinished work sometimes. She said that they probably had overlooked certain areas of the home, that they just missed building the ceiling to the closet, and the endless void I was seeing was merely a vacant crevice in the house, reaching up to the attic. This made sense, since our master bedroom was on the first floor, and the house had 2 stories. I hung up with the resolve that I was just overreaching in my mind, creating a conspiracy when in reality there was none. I didn't even bother explaining it to Emma, nor did she seem to care. She continued having nightmares about her ex, and all I could do was hold her each night when she'd wake up screaming. Luckily, the landlord scheduled for people to come out and fix the ceiling in a few weeks, something I was looking forward to. I was tired of seeing this dark void whenever I went to the closet to get something. As the days passed, I did my best not to think so much about the closet, instead diving into my work, since I had fallen a bit behind, spending so much time obsessing over the endless ceiling. Emma seemed to be adjusting well. She was constantly in a good mood. I could tell how much ease she was in, seeing how often she would smile and go about her daily tasks. though at night she would suffer from her dreaded dreams, ill-fated memories of that monster. I too continued having nightmares, almost the same ones. Sometimes different variations of the same dream, but the premise was always the same. Me lost in some horrid world made of gingerbread with those disgusting footprints following close, the sound of one step colliding onto the pavement and the other hideously sliding behind. I was always drenched in sweat in the morning, but things seemed to be getting better. Neither of us were going to let the dreams conquer our reality. We both knew it wasn't real, and perhaps we were just acclimating ourselves to a new environment. The only real issue we continued to have wasn't in the dream world. No, it was rats. They seemed to be continuing to scurry through our food in the pantry, always eating cookies or crackers. I set up traps to catch the rascals in spite of Emma's protest, which was a bit annoying, seeing as she wanted them gone but didn't want to hurt them. I felt it was a bit of an oxymoron, but whatever. Lucky for her, my traps never caught any of the demonic little critters. It's like they knew to avoid them. It made me giggle thinking of these rats tiptoeing around the traps like some animated mouse cartoon from the 1950s. We were constantly restocking our cookie boxes, and why not keep them in a jar or something to stop the nocturnal pests from taking them? Well, we love cookies. Both me and Emma don't like the way they taste when they've been sitting for too long in one of those jars. After a month, the ceiling was still not repaired, and every time I reached out to the landlord, she came up with a new excuse of why they couldn't come out. I even offered to hire someone to fix it myself, and that was apparently against our lease agreement. By this time, the one-time mystery that had consumed me no longer even tingled in my thoughts. I just accepted the darkness above as something mundane, and eventually it became normal, along with those lingering rats. We learned to buy enough cookies. We sort of adopted the rodents as pets, so in our minds we were a home of many, all cookie enthusiasts. Emma even joked and said maybe it wasn't rats eating our delicious treats, but rather Cookie Monster himself. It was nice to see her in such high spirits. Her smile always brought a level of warmth to my heart that couldn't be described by words. Her laughter was the most divine music my ears had ever heard. Her night terrors even stopped, much to my relief, since I always felt sleep-deprived after waking up each night to comfort her. Though my own dreams persisted, I never could escape that dreadful labyrinth of gingerbread, and any time the grotesque footsteps would catch up to me, I would awake. This was just life, and it was perfectly fine. Me and the love of my life only grew closer as the months passed. We even contemplated the idea of starting a family. I put my gun away and our family safe, no longer feeling as if I needed it to be within arm's reach. The neighborhood we lived in was perfectly safe. Our neighbors waved at us whenever we revealed ourselves to the world, and it was different than before. We came from a big city where you could be surrounded by millions to only feel like you're the only one alive. But here, everyone was a friend. We invited over one of our neighbors for a dinner party, Juan and Sara. They were a fun couple, and it was clear that Sara wore the pants in the family, as she would constantly talk over her husband. No judgment here. A lot of the time Emma would do the same. I asked our new friends about the neighborhood and the crime rate, and they both looked at each other and laughed, telling us that stuff didn't happen around here. They practically implied that this was paradise. Something about their demeanor put me off, almost like they weren't real, reading off of some script as they had rehearsed this many, many times before. Emma seemed to really enjoy their company, so I tried my best not to let it bother me. We continued to drink our wine and talk about a variety of subjects. That's when my girlfriend brought up the idea of us starting a family, and she asked about the local schools. That's when the once confident couple's face froze in what seemed to be apprehension. "You want to have kids?" Sara asked. Emma nodded, yes, in response, as she grabbed onto my hand. I studied the couple's eyes, trying to figure out what was so odd about wanting to start a family. That's when I realized I'd never seen any kids around here. Or, even more bewildering, I'd never seen any pets. Like dogs or cats or anything. Actually, now that I think about it, I don't see any pets or kids around here, I said. The couple seemed to be getting more flustered as I brought up the simple observation. It's against the HOA, Juan told me. I didn't understand. What HOA? I don't remember the landlord telling me anything about an HOA, and why would they be against pets or even kids? Wait, HOA? They don't allow kids? Before I could finish my question, Sara had interjected. I have such a sweet tooth. Do you have any desserts? Sure, I think we have some cookies, unless the Cookie Monster ate them already, Emma said playfully, as she got up to look for something sweet for our neighbors. Cookie Monster? Juan asked befuddled. I explained to them about the rats we had and how they were always rifling through our pantry, mainly eating our cookies. The couple didn't seem surprised to hear this, almost as if they had the same problem. Everything just seemed off. The conversation, the HOA, the closet, the rats. Something wasn't right, and I could feel the conspiracy side of me emerging like a bear awakening from hibernation. I think my neighbors could tell how inquisitive I'd become, because it was written all over their faces, or maybe it was the questions I'd been asking thus far. But as Emma searched for something to serve them, they excused themselves and said they had to leave. I escorted them to the door and bid them farewell for the night, asking one final question about the closet. Our closet's like that too. Around here, they all are, Juan said with a dreaded look on his face as he walked away. The next day I decided to do a little research. I went online looking for any clues about how this community was built. Quickly, I found the developer's name, some hotshot real estate mogul who lived in another country. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, though. There were plenty of conspiracy theories about the developer. Apparently his family was heavily invested into the occult, something about the lunar worship and how they congregated in the cities to pledge their loyalty to their god. I don't know, it all sounded silly. Eventually the family went into buying up real estate and developing land. Now they're considered to be philanthropists. I turned my attention to our community's webpage, searching for any mention about an HOA. Like my neighbor Juan said, we did have one, and there were guidelines, but nothing specific about kids or pets. It was mainly things about following city ordinances and keeping the neighborhood clean, though there was something about pest control and how crucial it was. I let out a slight chuckle underneath my breath, thinking about the rats that had infested my home. After a few hours of searching, I got a little bored. I don't know why, but I was nostalgic for old times, old friends, and my old life. Honestly, I hadn't spoken to my parents since I left my old city, so I decided to log into one of the old social media accounts I had. I know, I didn't delete all of them. I told Emma I did, but how can you erase half your life? Either way, I looked through old photos. I even reached out to some of my old friends. They all told me virtually the same thing. They thought I was dead. I think I was driving myself crazy, connecting dots that weren't really there, and the consistent dreams didn't help. I guess I just needed to feel normal again. After catching up with several people, I decided to permanently delete my account. After all, Emma was the only person I needed. That night I was asleep as soon as my head hit the pillow. And, like always, I was lost in the gingerbread maze. By this point, I had control over my anxiety, but even more remarkably, I was fully aware that it was a dream. I guess I was having a lucid dream. It felt amazing to have all the panic and fear I'd been experiencing for the last few months just blow away. Now, I was the one in control. I punched through the walls as if they were made of paper, fragments of gingerbread crumbling to the floor. I needed to know how to escape this place. I needed to know why I was here. That's when I heard the sound, the all-too-familiar sound of footsteps. Thud, scrape, thud, scrape, thud, scrape. I have to admit, even though I was fully in control of this dream, the sound of those ponderous footsteps stopped me in my tracks. As usual, the sounds were getting closer, but I swallowed my trepidation and clenched my fist, building up my courage to face this monster. I started walking towards the sounds, building up speed as my pace quickened, and to my astonishment, the footsteps stopped, perhaps bewildered that I was approaching it. But that's when another sound started, one I had never noticed before. It was like insects crawling over everything, the sound of slush and slime bombarding into one another. It was awful, and unsettling, but I continued walking towards it, and soon there it was, the demon that had been chasing me. I couldn't really see it, but what I could make out was how massive the beast was. It was hunched over, doing something, and that's when I realized those sounds weren't insects. It was the devil eating something. Crunch, crunch, crunch. That's when I woke up. I promptly sat up out of bed, gasping for air. I felt the room spinning as I gathered myself. I turned to Emma, but she was peacefully sleeping. I sighed out in relief and was ready to lay back down until I heard noises coming from the kitchen. It was the rats. I was finally awake to see the damn things. I got out of bed and made my way to the kitchen with stealthy feet, not wanting to make any noise and scare them away. As I got closer, I realized I wasn't sure what I was going to do with them when I caught them. Was I going to kill them? I had actually grown a bit close to the idea of them. The nearer I got to the kitchen, I saw the light was on. Rats turn the lights on? I asked softly. The noises only intensified as the warm kitchen light soon bathed me in its glow. That's when I froze in utter terror. It wasn't rats eating cookies. My blood ran cold and my skin crawled. My mind must have been racing 1,000,000 miles an hour. I didn't know what to do. "Jake, what the hell are you doing here?" I said. It was Emma's ex-boyfriend standing in my kitchen, eating cookies, grotesquely chewing while gnashing his sinister teeth. "It's been you all this time?" I asked. Still, he continued to eat, but the look he gave me was pure uncertainty. I realized he had a gun. It lay next to him on the floor while he used the other hand to continuously devour our cookies. In the moment, I felt my fear overcome me, and my limbs became dormant. The power that I'd had mere moments ago in my dream had dissolved into a mush of uncertainty as I used the few seconds I had to come up with some grand plan. "Where is she?" Jake asked. He had raised the gun and pointed it at me, malice protruding from his horrid face. This is what the dreams were about. This moment, building up courage, not running away like we did before. No, this time I was going to stop him from hurting Emma. I clenched my fist tightly, my knuckles practically bursting through my skin, my anger escalating. I didn't have a plan. I wasn't going to yell for help. No, I was going to kill him. I flung at the intruder, thrusting all my weight into him, and as I did my best wrestling move, I got the gun away. His grunts simmered in the air as I groaned from exhaustion, and soon we were shouting. We both struggled for control over the firearm as I gained ground. Soon the gun was pointed at the ceiling. I almost had it. I felt myself overpowering him. I was going to win this battle, and I awoke to the sound of struggling. I could hear the faint moans of Emma's sweet voice, terrified. As I came to, I could feel myself tied to a chair, my mouth gagged. I could feel blood trickling down the side of my head as I studied the ringing parameters of my ears. As the haze of cloudiness enveloped my view, I could see Jake on top of Emma. He had her pinned down on the bed. The sick bastard brought me into the bedroom to witness whatever this was. I tried to scream for help. I did my best to squirm around and break my restraints, but it was useless. This was going to happen. All I could do was cry in defeat. That's when, from the corner of my eye, I saw something moving. It was coming from the closet, the endless closet. Some liquid black substance poured out in a slush-like state. I could hear the slimy blob beginning to slide across the bedroom floor. Thud, scrape, thud, scrape, thud, scrape. But Jake was too occupied to hear it. The blob of goo approached closer behind Jake, and then it began to expand, like a sculptor's clay, forming into a statue. I could see the thing grow. It raised to the ceiling. I could make out a horrifying face within the goo, two massive arms that protruded from the dark substance. Emma looked up and could see the creature's form. She stopped moving from pure bewilderment. This, caught Jake's attention. He slowly turned his head and looked up at the being. I could see how terrified he was. He reached for his gun, but it was too late. The beast swallowed up Jake in mere seconds. He was absorbed into the blob. He screamed for help, but it only lasted a few seconds. When the creature fell back into its original form, it retracted back to the closet. Both Emma and I were utterly befuddled. It took several minutes for Emma to even acknowledge me. Then she rushed to my aid. No words were spoken. We just stared at each other, horrified. We knew what we had to do, and that was, we had to get the hell out of here. Both of us still in our night clothes, we rushed for the door, not bothering to get anything. I just grabbed my keys. To our astonishment, outside was all of our neighbors, standing together in the front yard, all quiet, just looking at us. I could see Juan in the middle of the group, standing next to Sara. "I see you met our HOA," Juan told us. I didn't have time for whatever the hell this was. Emma and I stormed past everyone, shoving people out of the way as we walked over to the car. I swiftly turned on the vehicle and burned rubber out of there, leaving the hellscape of a place. Emma sat quietly, still in shock for the whole event, and I reached out to grab her leg. She was ice cold. As I turned the corner, I realized I was going in circles. How was this possible? I could feel my anxiety return as I put more pressure on the accelerator. No matter where I turned, it was just a circle. I looked up at the welcome sign to our community. I had hoped it would signal some kind of exit, but no matter how much I drove, it remained the same distance. We've been driving for hours. It seems like we're stuck here, nowhere to go. Perhaps the HOA has to give us permission to leave. I finally parked by the side of the road, exhausted, dried blood encapsulating my wound. Emma's passed out next to me. She still feels cold, and all I can do is sob as I stare up at the welcome sign. Welcome to Ginger Hills. How do I even begin this? I know I'll sound crazy, but I'm not. Please, bear with me, no matter how bizarre this may sound. It all started when I was 12. So almost 9 years ago now. My foster sister Marley and I were riding bikes through the forest near the neighborhood when we fell. I don't know if I hit a rock or my wheel slipped off the trail, but the next thing I knew, I was rolling down a steep slope into a lower part of the forest. I'd felt Marley try to grab onto my hand, but she ended up being dragged down with me. I genuinely thought I was going to die, and Marley did too, with the stones and the branches cutting and bruising us as we fell. It felt like I was going to fall forever, but as I neared the bottom of the slope, I saw something. Some things. 5 pairs of eyes staring at me with such emotion, but I'm still not sure I can figure out what emotion it was. There were no bodies, no faces, just these eyes. They were just eyes. Me and Marley both narrowly missed landing on jagged rocks at the bottom, and when we sat up and looked at each other, we just screamed and burst into tears. She was covered head to toe in blood, scratches, and various injuries, and her skin was almost completely blue and purple, and green, nothing like her usual golden skin tone. She said I was the same, and I could tell by looking at my own hands and legs that she was right. Our clothes were torn and grass-stained, and the dirt stung at our cuts. It wasn't long before we both couldn't see through our tears, but just as the vision began to become clear again, I saw the eyes once more. There were 6 pairs this time, but I blinked and they were suddenly gone. At the time, I was more concerned about my injuries and assumed that I was imagining them, possibly from a brain injury that I had most likely endured when I fell down the hill. So I stood up and dragged my bike out of the woods with Marley following behind me. We didn't say a word until we were back on the street. It was only then that we noticed the blood we'd once been covered in was gone. Our hundreds of deep cuts were now just scratches, and our bruises were minimal too. We were shocked, to say the least, and confused, but we were grateful as well. When we entered our house, my mom fussed over us and threw away our torn clothes. I can't imagine how she would have reacted if we'd showed up looking like we did when we reached the bottom of that slope. Over the years, we came to the conclusion that we must have over-exaggerated it in our head, maybe from shock or fear, but we never forgot it. I couldn't forget those eyes either. I know I saw them, and I still do see them. As a teenager, I was a bit of a risk taker. I loved the adrenaline of doing thrilling things, but Marley, not so much. Whenever I did something impulsive or dangerous, I saw the eyes. Each time, there'd be one more pair. I've been to the doctor about it, I've talked to therapists, I've had my brain scanned, and they all say I'm perfectly fine. I don't hallucinate other things, and I'm not paranoid. I've learned to ignore them, and the uneasy feeling I get when I see them, and of course, the dreams that I have about them. I say dreams because they weren't really nightmares. Nothing particularly bad or scary happens when I see them, but they always freak me out. I don't tell people I can see them. I know what they'll say. It's not just some creepy story anymore. It sounds psychotic. Yeah, I see these pairs of eyes staring at me sometimes. I'm normal, though. Wouldn't that just, sound a little weird? Recently, however, I had to tell someone. A few weeks ago, there was a fire in my apartment. It had begun in someone else's apartment on the top floor, and I lived on the floor below them. I woke up to the sounds of screaming from outside, and the footsteps of people racing down the stairs in fear. I could already hear the fire engine noises in the distance, and my first thought was of my pets. I managed to pick up my dog and one of my cats and get them to safety, but I had to go back for my other cat. As I searched my apartment shouting, "Sadie!" as loud as possible, I started to feel lightheaded. I reached my door, but I had locked myself in when I shut it, and I collapsed when I couldn't unlock it. The last thing I remember seeing before I passed out were those eyes. There were hundreds of pairs. Or, I guess, maybe less, maybe more, I don't know. All I know was, I saw them. When I woke up the next day, I was in the hospital. I wasn't burned, I'd just suffered from some minor smoke inhalation. I left the hospital that same day and was completely unharmed. It also turned out Sadie had ran out of the apartment while I was taking the other two pets downstairs, so they were all safe. I had had an unusual dream that night, though. It was about the eyes, but this time they were whispering. They had no mouths, no bodies, no faces, but they were all talking to me at once. I was in a forest, surrounded by them, drenched in blood, but as their words grew louder and their stares grew wider, the blood turned into water, and I was suddenly in a warm pool. When I looked around, it seemed like I was in a hot spring, and there were thousands more of them around me. I'd never felt so calm, so relaxed, so safe. It was like heaven, until the heat became too much, and I woke up. I haven't stopped thinking about it. The eyes, the dreams, all of it. Today, I decided to tell Marley. I've been staying at her apartment, which we've discussed as maybe a long-term thing. We both like having a roommate. We were watching TV, I was on my phone, and she was on her laptop when I said, "Hey Mar, can I tell you something, but you have to promise not to think I'm crazy. I've had it checked out, I'm fine, but I really need to tell somebody." She nodded and was visibly intrigued, so I told her. I told her everything, starting from when we were 12 and I saw them for the first time. When I finished talking, she smiled and said, "Dulcie, I don't think you're crazy at all." "You don't?" I replied, relieved. "Nope." "Why not?" "Because," she leaned forward and whispered, staring deep into my eyes, "I see them too." Filth. Do you know how filthy something can actually be? Most people can bear a little untidiness. Some can't even handle a slight speck of dust. For me, I've lived surrounded by grease my entire life. My name is Alicia, and I have no idea how old I am. You see, I was born in a dirt-poor family, one that couldn't even afford the bills while living inside a trailer. But it was never because of a lack of job, or some other form of injustice. My parents were just addicted to spending. The moment money came into their pockets, they had the urge to spend it away for some stupid bullcrap. Not that I'm much better, I barely ever touch money, but every time I do, I get rid of it within the hour. Much more efficient than a serial killer at disposing of bodies. That's what I am, I think. So if they didn't bother taking care of themselves just for the thrill of playing, why would they care for their daughter? I was made aware early on that I was an accident. A rip was the reason I was born, and I got beaten anytime they felt like fixing their errors, ripping my skin and my sanity apart. Most of the time I was locked in my room, alone, yet surrounded by all the useless junk they bought. I wasn't showered, almost completely unfed, unchecked as well. I destroyed more stuff than most of you before I could even count. Each time, this earned me a beating because of an excuse like, "This could have been useful." No, it couldn't have been. I was attached to it. Of course you were. That's why you put it in here. But I didn't care, because this would give me some kind of attention. Sometimes, they'd take me to the hospital if the beatings got too much. But I think my parents were kind of important people. That's why the nurse never bothered to ask questions or send me away. Maybe an orphanage was full of other failures. These are the only explanations I have. Most of my baby teeth rotted away, replaced by imperfection that would sometimes hurt. I also decided to cut my hair myself using whatever tools I found inside my room. It was getting hard to feel that weight full of parasites and grease over my head. Then, it lied there for several months until one of them decided to clean it up after the smell got worse. Regardless, my clothes consisted of my father's too big or too malformed body, a cap, too wide for my small head, some shoes that he bought out of compulsion. They hid the misery better than the dresses that my mother gave me. I was looking more like a boy than a girl at that point, but since I wasn't allowed out, who really cared? Over time, though, the health issues started to pile up, especially around my arms. Some wounds got infected, and I had the urge to scratch it away, as the itch was getting unbearable. It wasn't the only area touched, though. Pretty sure I'm sterile now. However, it was the most visible, as I was forced to wear bandages that were in need of change regularly. This seemed to be the final straw for my parents. Maybe, again, I'm not quite sure what went down. Simply put, one night during a troubled sleep, I heard rummaging around in the house. This intrigued me, so I woke up and crawled towards the door. Sadly, I didn't have the strength to back off the moment I heard unknown voices. The two men who burst in seemed gigantic compared to my frail stature, entering the room, and they started grabbing hold of me. A catatonic state, some absolute fear, or maybe a drug. However it happened, I only know I fell unconscious and woke up some hours later after getting yelled at. It felt like my head was about to burst open, yet no tears or sadness came from me. I think this was genuine happiness. I didn't even care about their explanation. Whatever the Institute was like, it was sure in my mind to be better than being stuck in a room all day. I could finally go outside. Yeah, so much for disappointment. The only cool thing was that it was a castle, repurposed as an institute. But the more time I spent there, the more pure air made me suffocate under my own anxiety from the closed-off and stinky room that I had lived in. I think I hated people. That was probably it. Basically, my parents really had enough of me, yet didn't want to admit to their own faults as people. So, they decided the best course of action was to send me to an institute for naughty kids. That way, they could save face while I got mine carved on the sidewalk. Obviously, I'm being hyperbolic. Kind of. But the thing is, this institute doesn't treat any of us as people, just bad people who need to be corrected. Whether there's an addiction, physical, or psychological problems, we get yelled at for it. We're constantly under extreme stress, so I can't imagine how badly it affected the older kids. Obviously, when I arrived, I was immediately made the scapegoat for the others' frustration. Why? Simple. After being forced to wake up from whatever comatose state I was in, my mind was still numb. I was dragged to the office of whoever directs this mess. However, he cut his welcome speech the moment I entered the room, due to the horrid stench that wafted around me. To be fair, I got so used to it, I can't even tell you if I genuinely smell awful or not anymore. His eyes narrowed in disgust and scorn. I don't remember what he yelled about, maybe something about how undisciplined I was. This led to the two men who dragged me in forcibly making me bow by pushing my head down. It hurt. Then my parents complained about me as well, saying how much of a brat I was, referring to that one time I stole money as a good example of my character. Then, all 5 of them yelled at me to answer something, over and over, for God knows how long. Their voices continued to ring in my ears for hours after. Eventually, over my lack of reaction, they decided to take me and forcibly make me shower by trying to strip me down. That's when I struggled. I hate my body, even to this day. There's scars, evidence of lack of nourishment, the filth that corrupts and itches. I don't want strangers or even my parents to see this shameful display. So I punched and kicked and scraped and bit. One of the guys got hit in the eye. It's still visible to this day. So he hit me in the guts, and I don't feel so bad about it. They interpreted my resistance as a hatred of water or something. They got it wrong, but it's not like I expected them to understand, especially if my parents were filling them in on my well-being. Still, I lost the fight and got stripped down. It was horrible to feel myself naked without clothing or bandages to hide my body. What made it worse was their reaction. Disgust, yelling, more insults. I didn't quite get everything because my brain was shutting down. I felt like I was leaving my body behind. It felt nice for a moment before a slap brought me back to reality. I think I was bleeding at that point, or maybe my eyes were just tired from crying. It hurt like hell, but I don't like sleeping. In the end, they dragged me into the dorm with the others, explaining I'd have to rethink my behavior before being allowed to use the shower again. Actually, I think it was because they thought the filth was contagious. That's the first image the others had of me. A new kid with clothes sloppy put back together, too big for, disgusting. I don't think I ever felt shame like that again in my life. At least in the dark little room, nobody had to bear seeing me, and I didn't have to care about their judgment. Now, I had to deal with it. I wanted to shout something. The urge to break stuff came back in full force, especially when I saw that really tall kid, whose name I'd come to know as Conrad Levis, shield a younger girl's eyes, ombre de Flandre, from my vision. I wanted to break his hands. Over the next few months, I never got that bath. What I got, instead, was the right to be the target of every bully here. Everything in this place is violence. Shouting is the prescribed way of talking. If you're soft-spoken, become friends with someone strong. I wasn't really seen as a human here. The nicer kids had looks of pity on their face. The worst ones of hatred, either at my weakness or what I represented to them. Every human is kind of the same. We all feel good because of our similar things, but we're all bad and flawed in unique ways. Mine is that I'm disgusting. Sometimes there was this girl, Maureen Henry, who was being nice to me. She kept calling me by male pronouns, though. Maybe because... No, that's a stupid thought. I never bothered to correct her. I just wanted some of her attention, to think I was worthy of existing. So I accepted not being myself, because being anybody but myself was better, especially since I didn't feel worthy of being a human. Milo, Lillian, Maxwell, Jamie, Florane, they're all outcasts, yet they're either ignored or have someone to take care of them. But me, when I was by myself, not pretending to be anything that I wasn't, I was alone. Alone against the whole active student body, those that partook in every activity proposed by the staff, and that very same staff who made sure that for the longest time I'd stay at the bottom of the Institute's hierarchy. To be fair, unlike others, my parents didn't want me to heal or whatever. They just wanted me gone. These people, they could do whatever they pleased with me. That was when I took notice of a certain guy. He was probably the most violent here, judging by the smile plastered on his face when anything remotely dangerous happened. I'd say he was the closest thing to a sadist I've ever met, but he only took part in a beating when it was directed against me, where he made sure that each one of his punches connected. He didn't hesitate hitting me in nasty spots, too. At this point, I was so used to bruises and filth all over my body that the only question plaguing my mind was, why? None of this action, none of these quirks, nothing at all made sense to me. It all seemed to be monstrous, so there was no way someone this rotten actually existed. As to not lose more of my sanity, I decided to dedicate my free time to answering these questions. To entertain myself, I think, but on the first evening where I started to stalk him, well, he skipped over dinner and stayed alone. "I can smell you, you know." Any attempt at being discreet had been shattered in a few minutes. I didn't know what I expected, honestly. The filth was at its strongest. I was scratching my arms every minute or so, as the dried blood and crusty infected skin were all I could feel. Regardless of my cover being blown, I didn't feel any kind of fear, so I simply decided to stop the charade and meet him face to face. That was the first time I'd gotten a good look at him. He was unremarkable at first glance. I wasn't very tall, naturally due to my malnutrition, yet his height was only slightly greater than mine. His hair was dark and healthy, but it was shaggy. His skin was neither clean nor atrocious, a comfortable norm. Also, despite the fact that I knew he could throw a punch, he looked pretty scrawny. It was as if he was made to look as bland and inoffensive as possible. Now that I think about it, I've never really noticed him apart from those bursts of frightening euphoria. He was always blending in with the more violent kids who'd steal the spotlight, or off by himself on his phone. A phone? How stupid of me. It never really dawned on me that him having access to his phone at all times was a red flag. He was the only kid allowed with one outside of downtime. Well, as you'll see, it's more like staff just couldn't do anything about it. Going back to his encounter, his clothes did intrigue me because they looked fancy. A bit too fancy, actually. A white Kodak shirt with jean jacket over it. His pants were some kind of slim design, probably Levi's, and he had beige Timberland boots. There was also some sort of very loose blue and black neck warmer on him. Hand-knitted, I'd say. One that he'd hide his face in when he was stressed. A tick I noticed once when he generally got caught off guard by something out of ear range. Now, apart from the fact that only rich kids would have access to this type of wardrobe in this hellhole, and this rare species would mostly stick together, what bothered me was how pristine and clean his clothes were. Apart from the neck warmer, which was probably done by an amateur, nothing was out of place or damaged, even if the style itself looked a bit too flashy for me. For someone such as me that grew up surrounded by filth, I felt this attraction towards his clothes, a fascination, something I needed to touch. So I stared. I stared at the fact someone in a place like this could keep his clothes so clean, free from any abuse or fights. He took notice of this, bothered with how long I was talking. Are you really so disgusting that you feel some kind of fascination over proper clothing? The moment the insult left his mouth, I snapped out of my trance. I felt his piercing gaze on me, so I looked up. He was definitely unremarkable. I was almost disappointed the man who intrigued me turned out to be some boring, emotionless, unstable teen, one that had been thrown away by his family, like all of us down here. But then I saw his gaze, pure malice, shining through his thin, pitch-black irises. A crooked grin distorted his face when I flinched. I knew, as my guts were twisting, this guy was trouble, but I stayed because at this point, any feeling was better than numbness. I was disgusted by all my being. I cursed the universe for the crappy hand it had dealt me. Sometimes I dreamed of smashing things that weren't inanimate. Anger or nothing. Those were the two states I was always in. The childish enjoyment I felt in the room, smashing useless pieces of garbage or trying to read whatever text I'd found on the boxes. That was long gone. So, being afraid, excited, aroused, I don't even know. It just felt enticing. Finally, I was alive. I had the confirmation. Just by putting my meager life at risk. How mesmerizing. He spoke again. What's the matter? Can't you talk? Afraid I'll hit you again? He got closer, but I didn't back off. No point turning away now. No, I coughed. My voice was hoarse after failing to use it for so many years. I want to stay. These words were weak and didn't carry any weight to outsiders. But to me, a proper sentence coming out of my mouth was truly special. I saw the emptiness pass from his eyes for a brief moment. I was starting to get to him, I thought. His eyes would lighten up at the slightest controversy, the slightest fight, and he adored chaos, because this would distract him from his emptiness. But the moment I wanted to smile, thinking that, alas, I had met a kindred spirit, he hit me straight in the face. then again, and again, and again, until I was left barely conscious, breaking down in sobs. He stopped himself from punching me when I started to cry, and I heard him mutter, "That's better," before he giggled. Then he lent me a hand, the creepily calm smile he always had on his face most of the time back, one that was so unnatural, his eyes were forcefully closed as to not betray his true intentions. I took his hand, I had nothing else to do, and slowly got back up. The pain was just in my head. His voice was full of joy now. "Sorry about that. I was feeling really down. I needed it." Was seeing me suffer his way of uplifting his mood? But why only me? Why help me just after? Those are legitimate questions I should have asked myself on the spot. But at the moment, I remember only thinking that he needed me. So I only felt some kind of pride and smiled again. He kept his eyes closed before going ahead of me, so I had no idea what was going on in his mind when he took my bandaged hand without a second thought to pull me up the moment before. I didn't care about anything else. I was in heaven. A wrong, twisted, creepy sort of heaven, but at this point, I didn't care if this person was Lucifer, Satan, Gabriel, or Uriel. I just knew he was clean. A twisted paradise was better than a filthy reality. He then looked back, his face still contorted in its unnatural expression. "You stink. You should get a shower." My only thought was that he cared about me. I had even more trouble speaking, due to how hard he had beat me. "Can't," was all that came out. He looked incredulous. Why? No aggression or mockery, just an itch that needed to be scratched. I wanted to tell him everything, but I was too battered up. Some blood came out of my mouth. "Grounded," I stuttered. He laughed. A bit too hard, a bit too forced. "Really? You got grounded so badly you can't even use the shower? On your first month?" So only a month had passed, I thought. Spending all day in a locked room messed up my perception of time. I was feeling like I knew this guy for ages at this point. In reality, we were practically strangers. Maybe I wasn't the only person he beat up for his enjoyment. The thought made me sad. I didn't wonder why I felt sad then. I still don't know, despite my clearer state of mind. In the end, I simply nodded. He clapped his hands together. "Well, that explains it. I thought you were just an uneducated pig, but you're actually not. Let's get you freshened up." The relief I felt at that moment far surpassed any kind of offense I could have taken at the insult. I was about to finally get clean. The filth could go away somewhat, the infection that lay rampant in my itchy body, but I could still feel water on my skin. I craved it, hot or cold. It wasn't important. Then his grip tightened around my arm. It genuinely hurt me due to how sensitive it was, and it made him smile again. I suppose you do know, though, how things work around here. I was out of breath already. Just the two words from earlier deeply affected my throat. A squeaky, pathetic sound was the only thing I could muster. It amused him. "Answer me," he commanded. I could only let out a yes, almost audibly. Still, it sounded like music to his ears. "Good. I'll let you know what the favor is in due time." I can't actually grasp how long our exchange lasted, because it was actually past our curfew now. The night had settled in during this encounter. I didn't know the layout very well, let alone at night, so I was at his complete mercy. How deplorable of me not to have even felt the slightest amount of fear, instead just focusing on his hand. The same one that had crushed my arm and beat me a few seconds earlier. Was I so desperate for a human connection? Actually, yes. The question was foolish. Surprisingly, though, he actually took me to the shower. In the Institute, there's only the one room dedicated for students. There were specific times for boys and girls, although it didn't matter right now. I already guessed it was forbidden for us to not be in our dorms at this time, but this suspicion got confirmed when I heard a loud scream. It sent me into a panic attack, I think, because I latched onto the boy's arm and buried my face against his body. He didn't budge at the voice, though, nor did he push me away. I didn't understand what this guy was saying. He screamed way too loudly. I just know he was one of those that had shoved me into the shower. "Ah, Pom. Pleasure to see you tonight." That was when I lifted my head, as well as my cap up, to see if I was actually correct. He had no fear. He wasn't the slightest bit worried as the big guy approached us. He even humored him. I found that amazing. I couldn't even register what the other guy was yelling. Too busy admiring the man in front of me. "Listen, Pom, I'm just showering the newbie here. He couldn't get a shower in his first month. Let him have that at least, all right?" "Oh, he thinks I'm a boy." I couldn't care less, just like I didn't listen to a single thing this Pom guy said. I did become concerned when he started to grab me by the shirt. He wasn't. "Oh, Pom, calm down, man. Don't you remember our deal? No ruckus when I do illegal things. You wouldn't want your little hobby to be revealed to everyone, now would you?" The man spit back aggressively while trying his best to remain composed. "Listen here, you little shit. You're lucky you're not alone. The entire staff said they'd close their eyes if I accidentally disciplined you too harshly. You're walking on thin ice with this shtick. The moment you show any sign of weakness, you're dead." I still don't know why, but at that moment, I grabbed that guy's arm with my full strength. Fueled by some kind of despair, maybe fearing he'd be taken away from me, I managed to get out a small, "Let go." I'm also not sure what my face looked like, but the both of them seemed surprised. The one I was interested in, though, thankfully also looked delighted. "Look, Pom, let's leave it at that, all right? I swear not to break any more rules tonight." With a look of intense hatred exchanged, the man pushed my arm away and let go of him. He then cursed under his breath while we both proceeded into the shower. This guy, I still don't know the name, lit up the room before turning towards me. He smiled, and it didn't seem as forced as it had before, though I'd hardly call it natural. "You were pretty cool back there. Guess you do have a spine after all." Then the malice came back. "Too bad you're using it in a meaningless situation." This made me blush, so I pushed my cap down and stuttered, "You cooler." He let out a sort of aw sound and removed the cap to pat my head. The moment his hand made contact with my greasy, uncleaned hair, I just felt this overwhelming wave of happiness. I wanted to cry. I wanted his patting to never stop, despite how pathetic that sounded. I needed it. Sadly, it had to eventually. He made a show of how to activate the showers. I laughed when he accidentally turned one on himself. He got annoyed, but he didn't comment on it. He also showed me the different washing machines set up in a small room adjacent to the showers. It all seemed so funny, how normal it all was. It's strange how the guy that beat me up was also behaving like he felt we were friends. I felt comfortable. The bruises he'd inflicted on me today, the cuts from years ago, the constant filth, all that pain was gone just by casually talking to him. It was funny. So funny. A fuzzy kind of funny. Until he asked me to undress so he could put my clothes in the washing machine. Of course, it was so stupid. If we believed we were both guys, he would have assumed that there's no real problem with undressing. I should have told him sooner. But the funny thing is that my gender wasn't why I didn't want him to see my body. It was because of the filth. He raised an eyebrow. "Yeah?" I finished my sentence. "Filthy. Lots of disgusting." I was shaking more and more. I was about to cry by just talking about it. He laughed. It made me shiver. My head was hanging low. My arms were covering my body more than the clothes. He laughed again. I felt my knees losing their strength. He stopped, and I fell. "I already know that. Man, you smell so horrendous, everyone can spot you from a mile away. Your hair's so greasy that I can still feel it on my hand from a moment ago. I was literally trying not to barf when you latched onto me. Never do that again, by the way. And your teeth are beyond repair." I cried. He smiled. All that peace I felt, it just vanished in thin air. I started saying something. He cut me off with a yell and a laugh. Eh? Speak louder, I can't hear you. I winced. I hated loud, but I kept going. Heart is filthy. It seemed to faze him for a second. Lights left his eyes before he kicked me, and it shone again. Then I said something that neither he nor I could understand. I love you. Why? I don't know. I was feeling so many contradictory emotions. I don't know why, but this was the prevalent one. The first boy to be nice to me. That's how I responded, and I hated it. So he kicked me harder. Still, I got up and I tried to kiss him. He bit my tongue. I was crying. I think it was from happiness. Take responsibility for this girl's first. Then I felt unconsciousness as he looked at me with an empty stare that I couldn't comprehend. Nor could I understand just how obsessed I got with this boy. I was always bad with emotions. Scratch that. I was bad with everything. That was just me. Just Alicia. When I woke up, I was lying on one of the benches in the shower room, naked apart from a towel wrapped around me. My first instinct was to find my clothes, but I stopped because I felt cleaner. Even the bandages around my arm had been changed. I heard his voice next to me. He was sitting on the opposite direction. So you're a girl, I hummed softly. His voice was lost with all sorts of emotion. What's your name? Alicia, he responded simply. Toe. So, I finally had a name for that face. I smiled again. I wanted to thank him for the bandages, ask him how he knew how to make them perfect, but I was out of breath again. His voice, as bland as ever, added, Your clothes are getting dried. Wait for them. I'll be done in a few minutes. Then we'll be able to go. I guess I blacked out longer than I thought. His tone was somewhat bitter. We'll never speak to each other again. Got that? I didn't, so I grabbed a weak hold of him. He grunted. Stay? I asked. He punched me. I won't. I managed to get out. Please. He didn't do anything this time. Why are you here? He asked. I couldn't answer. Don't know. I was met with his arm around my neck. Why? Why are you here? I flinched at the yell, but I couldn't respond, either because I was about to pass out or because of the lack of oxygen. Realizing this, he withdrew and backed off in an instant. What a nice person. He cares about me, were thoughts flooding my head. This can't be right, he muttered. You must have done something. Anything. Just a bad deed. The one too many for your parents. I coughed, and I got closer to him. He seemed scared. I don't know why. I just loved him. I think that's the truest of all truths. You get closer to the ones you love. My voice was hoarse. Living? He was shaking. I lived too long, I sung. That's how I'd calm myself, but it seemed to unnerve him. How badly did I look? How badly was I scarred? For the unwavering to falter in my presence. A quiet alarm rang inside the dimly lit room. Your clothes, he said, before going to retrieve them. He threw them at me. Put them on, he commanded. Although emotionless, I could feel some kind of pity in it. Or maybe I was just imagining it. I did as I was told and felt whole again. He tried to speak, probably to order me to leave, but I attached myself to him with a hug. He tried to hit me, but his arms were locked and his kicks didn't hurt as much. Talk more? I asked. About what? He gave up and talked about it for a while. I responded quietly. I want to hear more about you. I want to learn more about this place. I want to make you understand how badly I need your affection, fake or not. Anything, now that you know who I am. I'm desperate for more. I'm craving for more. I'll do anything, because that's the sole thing which came out of my mouth. He didn't do anything for a moment, but ultimately he spoke. This place is hell. Yeah, I know. Only bad kids are sent here. I knew that too. Those who are so horrendous that their parents can't handle them anymore. that was but sometimes, kids like you, Milo or Amber, they're just abandoned. You could make the argument that all of us have irresponsible parents, but you three, you're just pathetic, mistreated infants who never grew up. You never deserved anything bad in your life. You couldn't have been sent here. I'm sorry. I was against his body. It felt weird for someone to actually apologize for how they treated me. I began to shake and wail, my voice never fully returning. He put his hands in my hair again, and this time it was clean thanks to him. It was still night when I stopped crying, but it seemed like hours had passed. I couldn't even stand properly, so we sat again on the bench in the room. He wasn't looking at me. Do you even know your age, Alicia? I shook my head. He sensed the movement inside. Do you even know how badly your body is damaged? By disease, I mean. I simply let out a word. Hurt. He visibly shook when hearing that. He wanted to tell me something, but shut himself. I didn't pry. I never did. However, he didn't seem to stop asking questions. What did you want to be as a kid? I pondered the question. I never asked myself what it was like to grow up in the room. Growth just came because my parents still had the heart to feed me as a toddler. They didn't care, but they weren't monstrous enough to just let a baby die in their house. Or maybe it would have been too inconvenient. I don't know. Do I even remember my parents correctly? Everything just blends in my heart and my head, even more nowadays. After a long silence, I simply said, "Happy." He shuddered. Musician? Having in my mind that little box I'd played for hours at the end of the room. There was another drawn-out silence, one I decided to cut myself. You? How? He turned to face me with that same forced smile he'd worn at the time. Did he even do it on purpose, I wondered? Well, I could tell you, but there's not much point. How I came to be sent here, becoming obsessed with violence, drama, conflict, finding out secrets. There's no reason, whatever the reason, I desperately needed to hear to feel closer to him. Yet, it's just a story I'd use to earn sympathy from you. I didn't mind. I've done it multiple times before screwing the person over. But you three, I can't bring myself to hurt you anymore. So, it's better that you don't humanize me too much. I prefer to play the unredeemable sadistic monster. Like a creepy crawly, I went on top of him while he was ranting. I just craved his affection. I needed it more and more. I wanted to kiss him again, just to feel it. Maybe do like the parents did sometimes after a big fight and make up. But he punched me away again. His face lit up in a smile as he saw me wince before looking horrified. I didn't understand why. I didn't mind. It was starting to get stale, though. He didn't give in to any more grand theatrics or maniacal laughter. He was starting to get boring. Maybe if I told Maureen about my real gender, she'd love me in a similar way. Maybe those rich kids would too. Are guys that aren't sadistic actually able to love me? Writing these thoughts down feels weird, especially since I'm still attracted to him. But they're also a part of me, a part of who I am. Me, little, pathetic, infantile Alicia, the one that craves attention the most in the end. I think I just met the devil and tasted the apple. They seem more welcoming than anything else. Pain, happiness, sadness. The more I think about these concepts, the more I wonder if they even mean anything. I just fluctuated between noticed and unnoticed, special to someone and special to no one. I wanted to do anything to taste it again. So, in this room, I asked, "Toe, what is your dream?" His eyes were empty, but they suddenly lit up, his grin coming back. Burn this institute to the ground, it and all its residents, teachers and students, giving them all a fitting retribution for their crimes. A massacre? That sounded insane. I guess it was, actually. But I muttered, "Need help?" His face contorted even more, a mix of horror and jubilation. The joy creeping to his face was clearly his dominant feelings. However, he said, "Don't kill anyone. Let me handle it. Just watch on the side." I don't understand why. I didn't even bother to ask why he wanted to do this, but I agreed regardless. That's when we finally left the room. He showed me the way back to my dorm, and we parted ways. For the following weeks, I didn't encounter any more trouble. I was free to shower, to clean myself, to even brush my teeth. I still had the infection, but I could mitigate them, and I was happy. I think I can proudly say I'm easy to please. The life at the Institute was still punctuated by harsh reprimands, insults, violence, but I found a sort of newfound joy in this. I even got along better with Marine, so I felt on top of the world, despite spending most of the day getting beaten. It was funny. I'd been a hunter for most of my life leading up to this incident. The smell of the warm air and the beauty of nature always had me at ease. I never felt scared alone at night in the woods because I had seen everything there is to be scared of. I've seen bears the size of small cars, animals so vicious that they'll kill anything that moves. The one thing I was never scared of was deer. I'd heard the tales of skinwalkers and wendigos and pretty much anything in between. My uncle was an expert on tracking and hunting. We always went on trips together and would always come back with a fresh kill. He did have a rule, though. I remember it so vividly because it was weird. He never wanted to go hunting in winter. I never asked why. I don't know, but something about it always had me on edge. One day during winter, I was about to go deer hunting when my uncle stopped me at the front door. When he came in, he saw my packed supplies and my rifle and knew I was about to go hunting. He immediately burst into a wrath of anger and dragged me to the wall to get into my face. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he said, spittle flying all over my face as he looked at me crazy. He looked primal, as if he was fearful of something that he didn't want to share. It's the same face you would expect a child to make if he was dumped in the middle of nowhere. The face of fear you see in people who have PTSD. I calmly brushed him off and got to the door saying I was going hunting. I was not about to fight with my uncle and ruin the trip, as I hadn't gone hunting for close to a month. When you hunt, you get adjusted to it, and when you go on break, you kind of miss it. As I got in my truck, my uncle peered at me out the window. He was there to take care of my house, but before I reversed, he left with the door open. My uncle's prone to outburst. As I should mention, he's only ever done it a few times, and it's always in a situation where the reaction suits it. Not this one, though. This one was bad, and I wondered what was so bad about hunting in the winter. The spot I'd planned was an isolated one. It was a very heavily forested area, which I hadn't been to before. I obviously had mapped the area out and brought essential survival tools in case the worst came, but I never thought I'd have to use it after all those years out in the woods. When I arrived, the crisp cold air immediately saturated me in discomfort. I quickly got another layer of clothes on before I started to walk to where I would set up camp for the night. The clearing I had chosen was a pretty tight one. There was a big tree in the center that stood tall above the rest. It was called the Forest Star, which suited it. Around the clearing, the forest was extremely dense. Almost no sun shone through the top. There was a small hunting tower north of the entrance of the clearing, so it was a direct walk from the camp. As I walked ahead, I noticed something. There were very small droplets of blood littering the ground. My first thought was that it must be from an injured animal or something, but the droplets were small and evenly placed. I shook the thought out of my head and made it to my setup as I started to pin my tent. When I was done, I checked my watch. It was about 5:30 p.m. I had about 2 hours for hunting before it was pitch black, so I made it to the tower. When I undid my rifle from the case, I heard scraping. Shaking it off, I took position and waited. As I stood there, time almost seemed to slow down. I was in a precise focus. I was ready for anything. I wasn't ready for what I saw, though. Out came 2 bucks that seemed injured. There were small droplets of blood coming from their eyes. As I focused in, I saw that it wasn't dried blood either. It was fresh, and it was oozing from their eyes. I was shocked. I'd never seen anything like it. Multiple scenarios ran through my head. Had a hunter shot both of them in the eye and managed not to kill them? But each scenario seemed more unlikely than the last. I took aim at the closest one and shot it. It stood there for a second, just not moving. Then they trotted off as if nothing had happened. Blood was running from the wound, so I'd obviously hit it, but it didn't seem scared or fazed. I decided that was enough and sort of jogged to my site. I was freaking out and decided that I'd cook dinner and go to bed early. When I got back to camp, I pulled out a tin of beans, grabbed a pot, and started a fire so I could cook them. As I cracked open a beer, the familiar sound of a branch snapping sounded off next to me. I brushed it off as I sat back to relax, thinking it was probably a small deer. I was thinking about the deer as I started to chalk it up to the fact that I must not have hit deep, and the deer was in shock. When I finished eating, I went to bed. I was shivering in the night cold, and I could hear my body shaking uncontrollably. As I dozed off after a brutal 2 hours of cold, I heard another snap. This time, it was a lot louder, though, like a bear. I immediately grabbed my rifle and got out of the tent. My fire was burning low, and in the distance, I saw 2 red lights. I walked towards them when my mind started to race. Something felt wrong. As I closed the distance, my guts were literally twisted. My mind was anxious, and I felt like I was about to break down. Then I realized what was wrong. Those weren't lights. They were 2 big, beady, solid red eyes. There were no pupils. They were just orbs hovering. I stood frozen in realization. I thought it was a big cat, but what emerged was much worse. Its fur was black, darker than the night around us. Its antlers grew twisted and uneven, but the worst part was it was crying blood. Deep red droplets were pelting down its unnatural face. I couldn't make a sound. I was frozen in fear. Then it made a sound like a baby crying. It was horrible. The sound of unnatural wails filled the cold air, making it worse. My body felt crumpled, so I finally broke out into a sprint. When I looked back, it was still there. It wasn't even breathing, but the sound of that baby crying wasn't fading. It was like a speaker was attached to my ear. When I made it to the camp, I rushed to pack my stuff. In a hurry, I ran, leaving the tent behind, and rushed onto my truck. As I fumbled with the keys, I saw that something was walking slowly towards me. That's when the whispering started. Terrible, faint voices echoed throughout the forest as my mind started to close. I felt my cerebral melting as I sat there in a kind of sleep paralysis. I found the strength to finally open the door and get in my car. I slammed it shut, and that thing was right at the window. I started to sob as I jammed the key in the ignition. My mind felt fried, and I swerved out of there. I didn't care if I hit anything. I just wanted to be away from that thing. Before I could properly back out, it stood on its legs, and it repeated a voice I recognized. You do not escape this. The forests are mine. It was my grandpa's voice. He died when I was 6, and I never knew any of the details. The thing then made a howl, a terrible shrieking howl that hurt my entire body. As it did so, I heard scampering as more of those things came out. They had blood running from their eyes as well. The baby cries started again, and that's when I finally drove out of that place. When I raced home, I immediately barged into my door. My shoulder ached, but I didn't care. I shoved the door and locked it and ran into the kitchen. That's when I saw my uncle sitting at the table, enjoying a glass of scotch. So, you saw what I did, didn't you, Anthony? I couldn't form words. I was so shocked. My uncle came up to me and put a hand on my shoulder. What you saw out there is my rule I abide by. There are things in those forests in winter that are so horrible even the most seasoned can't handle it. I saw it when I was a boy, and since then I don't hunt during the winter. I finally mustered a sentence. What was it? He took a deep breath before sitting down. You saw something called the Urabarak. It's an ancient being that dwells in the forest during these winters. Hunters who see it usually are never the same again, but some never come back home. I was lucky. My uncle sort of sniffed as he told me about his encounter with the Urabarak. When I was 23, my father and I went out into the woods on a very cold winter to hunt. Our family was struggling, so we didn't have much food. When we were hunting, my dad called out to me, but before I could even get to him, I heard him yell out before he went silent. I never saw him again, but what stood there was worse than the loss of my own. A deer with red eyes, black fur, and twisted antlers stood there. Blood ran from its eyes. Then it started to cry like a baby. My uncle broke down and had to take a few seconds before continuing. I comforted him as I was teary-eyed too. It ran after me, Anthony, on two legs. It was like a human, and I rushed to get away from it. But I wasn't quick enough. He rolled up his sleeve and revealed a terrible red scar that ran across the entire underside of his arm. It was trying to feast on me. It knew I feared it, but eventually I managed to lose it. He finally finished his scotch before continuing. I was stuck in those woods for 3 days, fighting to survive. I heard its cries and whispers all around as I tried to make it out. I finally arrived at the road and was taken in by police. No trace was ever found of my dad, except for one thing. They found blood at the scene and tested it. It was my father's. What was strange about it is it was mixed with his tears. My uncle finally stood up. Fear it, for it knows who you are. Those were his last words. He left my house, and the police found him wrapped up in a noose 2 days later. It broke me. My hunting buddy and best friend was gone. There was one detail about his suicide that was never resolved. He had droplets of blood coming from his eyes. The coroner inspected it and said it had been an aneurysm, but I'm not so sure that's the truth. I'm 50 now, and I haven't been hunting in 2 decades. I can't even go into the forest anymore. I'm thinking about going back and seeing what Urabarak is. Maybe I can kill him. Beware the Urabarak, for he lurks in the cold. Since people seem to enjoy my last creepy tale from Appalachia, I'll start writing the rest down, while I've still got some breath in my lungs. When we were kids, my older brother and I used to play army out in the woods, deep in the hollers and on the ridge tops of the South Appalachians, in western North Carolina. We built all kinds of foxholes and forts and walls and trails and everything in between. You name it, our imagination could frame it out and build it up. We never felt uncomfortable, never felt watched, or even kind of uneasy. Until one late fall weekend where the leaves were starting to let go, but still crunch beneath your feet just before the snow came down. We had marched a mile or so back through the old logging trails, grown up so thick you could scarcely get a grown man through in some spots. We found a perfect spot to start the next fort. It was flat, no trees, about 50 feet, both long and wide. Plenty of leaves covering it meant a good raking of them up into piles at the clearing's edge would make for impenetrable walls for our imaginary attackers. We set to work with only our feet in our hands, as we hadn't grabbed our father's tools that day to clear the leaves from the clearing. We set about piling them up as best we could along the edges. We decided we needed a foxhole to hide in, directly in the center of the clearing. As we redistributed more and more of the leaves, we discovered 9 large and oddly shaped rocks that formed a neat circle in the center of the clearing. We didn't pay much attention to the discovery at the time, and diligently worked at our task at hand. It started to get late, and we could hear our mother whistling loudly through the autumn forest for us to come home. We relented and decided to grab a rake, mattock, and a shovel the next time we were out, so as to build our impregnable fortress the best as possible. As we walked home, the forest came alive with all manner of nocturnal critters. Coyotes yipped and barked, bobwhites cooed, owls screeched and hooted. It was relaxing, and the air was warm, but only just in our faces. My brother and I laid our plans out for the next day to build our ultimate fortress. We went so far as to draw up a rudimentary blueprint, complete with the large rocks that occupied the newly found fortress site. As we looked closer at the blueprints, we realized that the rocks had formed a circle. Perfect. We would be able to fence it in and build the foxhole right in the center. We ate our dinner, not speaking a word of our plan to our parents, and took an early leave for bed. We awoke early in the morning before our parents and went to grab all of Dad's tools we would need for the day. The air was so much cooler this morning than the last, and slightly breezy, with an overcast sky keeping the warmth of the sun out. We donned our coats and hunting orange beanies so as to be safe in the woods during hunting season, per our parents' instructions, and set off. As we walked, my brother and I noted the eerie silence, but chalked it up to the cool and windy weather. The only wildlife we observed were a few ravens that seemed to observe us as we walked, never flying away as we approached, but rather watching us from the tall trees. As we trekked our way back the mile or so into the wilderness, we talked excitedly about the fort we were going to build. We alluded as to how our older cousins would be jealous when they came to check it out. As we came upon the site, I noticed an eerie feeling of unease, like we were trespassing, and someone or something didn't want us to be there. I thought nothing of it as we set about raking the leaves into a wall. After an hour or so, all the leaves had been raked out of the clearing and into the edges, forming a neatly stacked little border wall. All the while, my uneasy feeling of some sort of transgression never really ended. My brother took notice and asked me teasingly, "What's wrong with you? You afraid of the woods, you little girl?" And I laughed, but I replied, "It feels weird out here, like we're not supposed to be here." He called out some names and told me that he would protect me from anything out in the woods that came to get me, in true older brother fashion. This didn't put my uneasiness at rest, but I lied and told him that he'd made me feel a little better by saying it. The time had come to start our foxhole in the center of the clearing within the rock circle. We started with the mattock, breaking up the ground and pulverizing the tiny rocks as we broke through the long, undisturbed surface of red clay that is so common throughout the southern Appalachians. The deeper we gouged into the earth, the worse my feeling of uneasiness grew, until it was pure dread. I had been shoveling out the dirt as my brother broke it up, and I stopped. He sank the mattock into the earth a few more times, and as he looked at me, seeming to ask why I had stopped, he brought the tool down one more time with a resounding clunk. He had struck something. Before either of us could exchange questions, I forgot my feeling of dread and began shoveling again, feverishly this time, to see what we had hit. Maybe it was treasure. Maybe it was a meteorite or something cool. As I brought the dirt out of the hole and onto the surface, it became clear what we had struck. Stained red by decades of subterranean existence in the ferocious clay was a human skull with a large chunk taken out by the mattock. We stepped back in absolute horror, all excitement and happiness drained from our demeanor. I, being 8 years old, screamed and began to cry. It felt like we had killed this person ourselves. It felt like we had stashed the bodies here, and prayed not to get caught. My stomach churned, and I vomited my breakfast onto the clearing floor. As we reeled from the revelation, the very atmosphere around us seemed to grow cold and unfriendly, like we had disturbed something unnatural. We stood in the silence for what seemed like eternity as the wind shifted the tree branches around us. I heard what I thought was our mother whistling for us to come home. My brother heard it as well, and we both lit out for the house, not wanting to spend any more time in the presence of whatever we had exhumed. As we walked back through the woods at a much quicker pace than we had entered, the claustrophobic trail seemed to get even more tight in places. At times, they almost seemed unfamiliar. It was like the forest itself was trying to keep us from getting back to the safety of our home. We finally burst through the trailhead, tools in hand, just as a bolt of lightning split the sky, arcing down in all directions like nature itself had become infuriated by our actions. We walked inside after putting the tools away, just as the downpour started. I called for our mother throughout the house, but there was no answer. We walked around towards the carport and saw that Dad's car was gone. Though it was before the golden age of cell phones, my father was provided a company phone that he always kept on him, so we picked up the landline and dialed him. Mom picked up the phone, much to our relief. They had stepped out to get pizza and a movie from Flick Video because they didn't want to cook tonight. For a brief few hours, we forgot about the terror of the day. For the most part, there was still a gnawing, biting feeling in my stomach as we sat and watched the movie Mom and Dad had rented. As it grew nearer to bedtime, the feeling of dread returned, growing stronger all the time. I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned for hours until I eventually found a comfortable enough position to drift off. I began to dream that I was once again on the trail to the clearing, only this time the sun was not out, but the orangish-yellow glow of the harvest moon lit the entire path like a giant lantern in the sky. There were no stars, only the moonlight emanating from the blackness of the night sky. As I walked, my feet made no sound, even when stepping on dried-out twigs or leaves. This had to be a dream, yet it felt so real and lucid. I walked almost as if my body was controlled by someone else down the path to the clearing. As I drew nearer and nearer to the site where we had unearthed that strange and unmarked grave, I began to notice a pale glow coming from the clearing. Upon approaching the area, I noticed something that I won't soon forget, though it's been 20 years since I've seen it. The origin of that pale glow was a hunched-over, wrinkled, gaunt woman. Her jet-black hair hung in very thin wisps off her head. Her lips seemed to have dried up and decayed off her thin and leathery face a long time ago. She was stark naked, covered in a fox fur, the glowing fungi that is found throughout Appalachia. She was sobbing and mourning softly as I kept my distance and observed her. I inched closer to see if I could figure out what she was hunched over, and when I did, a twig snapped underfoot. Time stood still. My heart raced and my skin began to sweat in the split second that it took for the sound wave to reach that ghastly-looking woman. Her gaze immediately snapped in my direction with an unnatural speed, and at all the wrong moments for any human on this plane of existence. Her piercing eyes were further apart than a human being's should be, and devoid of pupils. Her nose was bulbous and hung off her face like a diseased zucchini squash. Whatever the hell this was, it was no longer a person, if ever it had been. Her eyes immediately locked with mine, and I knew I was caught. She screamed an evil shriek, shrill and terrible. I immediately wheeled around and began to run, but to no avail. I only gained about 4 steps before I felt a grab and a mighty pull on my ankle. I was mid-step, my leg in mid-air, and I met the earth with a hard smack. When I regained consciousness a few minutes later, I was being dragged across the forest floor towards the clearing by this woman-like monstrosity that stood a full head and shoulders above any man. I was too dazed and confused to scream, and I could only watch in horror as this thing dragged me across the forest floor towards the center of the stone circle. Perched upon the 9 stones were the very ravens which my brother and I had seen in the daylight, their beady eyes focused on mine, cawing and cackling as I was thrown into the circle of stones. I looked up into the face of the thing that had dragged me to where I lay, and as I did so, she burst forth with the most shrill and evil cackling I had ever heard. It filled the airways and resonated within the very earth upon which I lay. Her gnarled and cavity-riddled teeth jutted haphazardly from her overly large mouth at different angles of varying degrees of sharpness. Her black, diseased tongue licked what remained of her putrid lips as she cast her gaze downward at my helpless body. The ravens began to caw in rhythm as she reached out towards me with long fingers that terminated in sharp, dagger-like nails that were more akin to claws than fingernails. The cawing quickened as she made contact with my chest. I felt the nails sink into my skin as I screamed out in pain, still unable to move. The cawing grew louder and faster, drowning out my screams, just as she began to grip my chest to rip through into my body. A light split the sky then, so bright that, for a moment, all I could see was the white. The woman screeched a blood-curdling shriek. Then, the light was suddenly gone. When my vision returned, the woman was gone, the ravens were gone, the graves were covered over, and there stood my brother, in the midst of a frigid downpour, with shovel in hand. Not a word was exchanged, but we both knew what we had just witnessed. He pulled me up from the ground, and we headed for the trail towards the house. The rain slacked and stopped as soon as we were out of sight of the clearing, and the stars finally came out. The moon was just coming up. Its pale, soft white glow lit our hike back through the hills and hollers. We walked into the basement instead of the main entrance, so as not to wake up our parents. We shed our rain-soaked clothes, and as I took my shirt off, I noticed 5 deep punctures that had scabbed over. My brother dressed the wound as we both exchanged glances, and I slept in his bed that night, even though we were past the age of this being acceptable. We never told our parents of the event. We never spoke of it again. I did some research years later and discovered the story of an older woman who'd been accused of 9 counts of witchery in the 1700s in the fort where my hometown lies. As such, she was burned in the square where the old fort was located. To this day, on autumn nights, from the safety of our parents' back porch, you can still hear an old woman cackling on cool autumn breezes.